This is Chairman Jack. Today we are doing a video that's either going to be a podcast or really depending on what we want to title it. So that's to be determined, but you'll know when you see the title. Today we're going to talk about leftist censorship and suppression. So I'll let everyone else introduce themselves. This is Volgin.
Hi there, friends. This is Comrade Taras.
Ormica.
Hello, comrades. This is Comrade Wiktora.
When we talk about leftist suppression, first off, of course, right wingers don't believe it and so on. But specifically, sorry about that. I wanted to focus on the Communist Control Act of 1954 because it's a really interesting case in. I don't know if I want to call it doublethink, but where you have, if you go into the history of the Communist Control Act of 1954, which made it illegal to be a member of the Communist Party, you have a really interesting situation where there was actually there's no legislative record behind it. They had allegedly written it in an hour period between 12 a.m. and 1 a.m. to push it as quickly as possible. And it was actually a branch off of a bill that started a little earlier. And what's interesting is later amendments would be added that would make it so that all you had to do was be communist influenced, and you could be jailed up to 5 years and with a $10,000 fine, or both actually. And it's just a jury. It's just a jury that determined whether or not you were communist influenced. There were a couple of high-profile unions that actually expelled whole chapters of their own union organization for fear of the United States prosecution of them. I think specifically the AFL-CIO got rid of 8 chapters. At least that's what I remember from the documentary on the American Communists that you can just find on YouTube. But they interviewed them, and they talked about how they were expelled from all those unions.
Yeah, I remember hearing this, and honestly, it was a Phil Ox song, "Love Me, I'm a Liberal." He talks about that a little bit. Funny enough, was talking about the people's cheering on the AFL-CIO mass kicking out, wholesale a quarter of the union and things like that. Like wholesale just demolishing the union in order to get rid of any communist influence. And that was really when you started to see this wholesale sellout from rather than working for the people, working with the corporations.
Yeah, and then what's interesting is that the bill was kind of proposed as like this liberal thing. When initially there was a Republican who did it. A Republican did it, and then the liberals, I think it was Humphrey, got in line, and just all of them simultaneously, like it was the perfect setup. It's one of the fastest bills that has ever been written and then pushed through. Their class solidarity with the bourgeoisie was shown right then and there.
Yeah, I think it's very emblematic of how things went with this very big second Red Scare that still permeates in our society to this day, was how quick and rapidly things just changed on a dime. Like how basically overnight they decided to wholesale sell off mass parts of the union and push them downstream, yet nothing really bad came of it, and they were just so dearly blackmailed and all that stuff. Like they were blackmailed to a T to make sure that all these communists would not form a rival union and things like that, and couldn't get any jobs and put all these people out of work. And I think that's a thing that leftist suppression has never talked about as much. It's talked about to a degree, but how messed up people's personal lives got due to the Red Scare, and how people, if they were gay, were always in fear of losing their job because they might be outed and things like that. Like how leftists have just had to basically go underground from the 50s all the way up into the civil rights era, and then they could only come out, in large amounts. But the moment the civil rights era ended, it just collapsed back in on itself, and only now are they able to come out a little bit. But now you're even getting the unmasking Antifa laws and things like that, to tear down people again and push them back underground.
Right, and
go on.
No, you're good.
I just wanted to add a small comment, then you can go back, Ormica. Jackson, Chairman Jack just mentioned about, gay people fearing for their lives, and McCubbin's book, which I recently finished, just talked a lot about, gay baiting and whatnot, and gay baiting was really utilized.
Can you explain what gay baiting is for people who don't know?
So, imagine, like, you're in a middle school playground or whatever, and then someone calls you gay, and that destroys your entire reputation then and there. It doesn't matter if you're gay, heterosexual, bisexual, blah blah blah. It just matters that there's a negative stigma with, the word gay, and if you're classified with that term, it's like you have the disease, basically. And, this goes on to spread to a lot of concepts in a lot of areas, and how gay baiting was used in, say, like, union organizing, because every capitalist nation hates unions. Let's just agree with that. All it took to just shut down union organizing was to simply call one of those, high-profile union leaders, either through a whisper campaign or explicitly in newspapers, gay. This person, gay. They're a sin. Make up a million excuses, but it always involved the word gay in some context. So basically, gay baiting is a way to destroy unions, politicians, even figures like McCarthy when he got gay baited out of nowhere. But, a separate discussion for a separate time. Ormica, can you please go on?
Oh, yeah. That's actually pretty interesting. I don't think I've heard about McCarthy being gay baited. But on the point about the just general leftist suppression, I do think that people think that it's gone or that we're nice and free and whatnot. But first off, the Communist Control Act is not. It hasn't been deemed unconstitutional except in a couple of states, so it's still there. The Supreme Court hasn't ruled on it. It still exists. It still could be enforceable. And what's more interesting is that it set a little precedent. Like in my home state, if you were to come out and you work for the state, and the state has a lot of employees, but if you were to come out and even just criticize people like Governor Gary Herbert, there was a lady who we worked with who was actually fired because she was in the driver's license division, and she had criticized him on just Facebook. He criticized him on just Facebook, and I know myself. I don't have any verifiable evidence for this because I was on probation at the time, and because we're a right to work state, because I was on probation, they can literally fire me for anything. But when I worked with the driver's license division, I had a squeaking clean record. I had no family members who had anything to do with identity theft or what have you. And after 3 months, I had talked with the police investigator. I was like, okay, I have somewhat radical views because, you have to downplay that if you're trying to get a job. And he was like, oh, that's no problem. and then I've done literally nothing wrong and had actually started meeting their figures, and I myself was fired from the driver's license division, and they've done a lot of things where they fired state employees just for speaking out, and then much less for their radical views, which I've never directly attacked the Utah government before that time. And I think that means that the Red Scare is still very much there, and I think that the Communist Control Act definitely set a precedent for each individual state.
Yeah, I think it set the precedent, and even in my state of Michigan, is that like it set the precedent that you can go after any grouping. Like in Michigan, you can be fired for being gay if you don't come out. Like if you come out, you can be fired.
Right, and that unmasking Antifa law, I think Volgin was going to talk about it.
Yeah, regarding the Antifa law, I think something needs to be said regarding it that. So, Antifa means anti-fascist. So, I mean, obviously, everyone in this video is anti-fascist, as well as I assume, most people. I mean, though right wingers always say that, it's this, it's this evil. The whole thing is that this law is supposed to say that Antifa is this domestic terrorist organization where it's not even an organization; it's a movement. It's a broad, it's a broad movement made up of many different organizations, parties, and whatnot. So saying that it's illegal, to be a part of Antifa because Antifa is a terrorist organization is literally making being against fascism illegal, thereby legitimizing more this incredibly far right wing ideology that the United States represents now and has for a very long time since its founding, pretty much. So I think it's incredibly dangerous the developments that are going on here because of the potential that it holds with suppressing even the most basic of left wing groups, not even communist groups necessarily.
Yeah, I think to quickly go off of that would be a good quote from Snowden, or Edward Snowden, where he said, what was the exact quote? Authority loves any new authority it gets. Like authority, the moment you give them anything, you can, they don't want to let go. So after the Patriot Act is still being renewed to this day, even though 2001 was nearly 20 years ago. There's no reason for it to exist anymore, as we're not in the same climate.
Well, and that's the thing, is that after a certain period of time, like, it becomes like more and more evident that these issues are cultural as well as like systemic, like in a very like material way, as well as like in terms of how people process and think about the world and stuff. Like people, like what we're talking about with openly targeting LGBT or openly targeting leftists. That's stuff that gets ingrained into the way people like think about stuff and ingrained into the way people interact with their world, as much as it becomes like an issue with the way governments are organized and the way laws are passed and stuff like that. Like it's two heads of the beast,
Yeah. Talking about that and, materially and culturally and whatnot, kind of a side tangent, but kind of not really, is the fact that, if you effectively want to make your censorship work, you can even see with the communists, and especially when the unions started kicking out their communists, first you have to physically censor the people, whether it be through, death squads, literally running them out of everywhere to the point where they're homeless and can't do anything, or sent into a hospital through a coma, or an insane hospital, insane asylum. And then, censorship can't just do the job alone. You can't just leave this blank area, because eventually people are going to get suspicious of, like, well, who was this person? Why did this person, get killed or whatever? And that's the part where the media steps in and fills in that, that convenient gap, whether it be done, again, by Death Squad, blah, 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 blah. And media, puts in propaganda, which I always say that censorship is always the underhand. Propaganda is the underhand of censorship, because it's also trying to censor out, who the person was killed, most likely a communist, gay person, we can go on, and then tries to replace who that person was. That's why we have all the Red Scare propaganda saying that, communists are going to bomb your house, communists are going to, do blah, blah, blah to your woman or whatever. I mean, we can even go back to those posters, and we can just pick them apart of how propaganda posters are censoring the truth. So, that's just my little side tangent on how they need to kill people and then let propaganda fill in the job of actually censoring things.
Right, and I think that one of the things that media, what we need to realize about the media is, of course, in a PBS investigation to create their and they're by no means perfect, but to create their documentary Democracy on the Line, they found that about 6 corporations control 90% of the news media we see on TV, and if one class gets to dictate the media, and even on online spaces, actually, but if one class gets to control the media, not even just like a large portion of a single class, like that's a small portion of a small class of people who get to control what they say or what everyone gets to hear about the news. Like there was this case actually with the here in Salt Lake, we had a homeless shelter. We had a homeless shelter that was closed down. It had about 1,000 beds in it, and it was split up between 3 locations that had about 745 beds, right? And that obviously was unacceptable. So some of the leftist organizations here teamed up to do the Take Shelter, or to make the Take Shelter Coalition. And they sat out and protested on Washington Square, right? And they were able to take pictures before, but or during the start of the protest. And here they are, they're protesting, and then the city, of course, gets the police involved, and the police ransack it. And then after they ransack these protesters and the little camp that they had, they ransack it, and then they post on Twitter pictures of the after they ransacked, and then said, "Look how dirty these people are making Washington Square. Like they're not taking good care of it. They're just rabble rousers, stuff like that." And so, yeah, no, it was absolutely disgusting to watch. And even our mayor Aaron Mendenhall, participated in this, and they had destroyed it. And these organizations, of course, well, they posted the real pictures of before the police raided this little camp, and that didn't get nearly as many views, and that wasn't the narrative. Even local newspapers like the Salt Lake Tribune, and they all reported the way the police saw things, which is not factual at all. And that wasn't, this wasn't 1954. This wasn't 10 years ago. This was literally at the start of this year. This was in January that they did this, and they can get away with it.
disgusting, to be honest. And just relating this somewhat back to my side tangent, like we should probably have a proper discussion on propaganda and what it does, but again, for another time. But, just going off of your example and just how the media, build their own narrative or formulated their own content, for that matter, like, they purposely, like, we have to also say this. Every message has a thing that they want to say and a thing that they're purposely leaving out because it'll contradict what they'll say. Because if we included the photos of the police, or even videos, because that'll be better, videos of the police just ransacking it, the entire message of the aftermath would be completely destroyed. But, there's also an insidious factor, especially with the online space, that even if those videos, those pictures, even key witnesses were to speak up, the media corporations would purposely try to, what was that term? Blackout? Yeah, blackout websites, blackout users, because, again, running against the mainstream narrative. So, that little, footnote of views and whatnot is a key factor. It's who gets to see it more, gets to see what they see. Sorry, but yeah, there's no way, especially with 6 corporations owning all of the media, that they're ever going to run any counter narrative. Maybe a milk cake toast's liberal, but even then, they're still going to say all their anti-union, anti-worker shit. But I digress.
Yeah, I think it really ties into, I don't know, just this domination of media and just like overall having a control over the narrative and having a control over the way history gets told really ties into how just narrative in general is so manipulable, and how like historiography is something that is as objective as it may try to be, and the ways that we try to talk about history may try to be, like there is so much bias and influence in that. And especially when you're looking at in the United States, like in an imperialist framework, like you have to contend with the fact that there is layers upon layers of narrative bias and changes to the way that history is told. Like you aren't operating under like a clear lens, like you're looking at history as it's being told to you, but not history as it actually was, because you have to contend with the fact that there are so many like class interests and power interests and so many other forces at play here, which is like exactly what leads to leftist suppression, is that they they need to retell history, and they need to manipulate history every day through stuff like controlling media, through stuff like shutting down these groups, and shutting down leftist support for their communities when the government itself won't do it. In the face of austerity, I think it just speaks to how systemic this is, and how many pies they have their fingers in. With just like the ways in which they're able to manipulate how we experience the world around us.
Yeah, I think it's kind of shows how important it is to view things, dialectically. Like if we just continue in this, oh, this group is bad because of this reason, and this group is bad because of this reason, and without connecting anything, all it leads to is the easier, creating this false narrative and
Right.
false consciousness of how is this history came about. Well, let's not talk about how groups have been ever suppressed. Like it was a side tangent in my AP Gov class to talk about Schnecht versus the United States, which was a case where a guy basically demanded, gave a speech where he asked people to start burning their draft cards, and that's where and he got arrested for it and got sent to years in prison due to saying that he was causing a public trauma or public disturbance, and it didn't count as freedom of speech, as it was comparable to quote unquote yelling fire in a crowded theater, and that's where that term comes from. Is this case of destroying, like getting rid of the right to oppose the draft and saying everyone has to be on board with the World War I draft. And I think it's a very emblematic, is just look at how they took like, oh, don't, like A Boy Who Cried Wolf. They basically turned that "Don't Scream Fire in a Crowded Movie Theater" into a Boy Who Cried Wolf story, rather than talk about, well, everything leading up to it, how the Debs case was based off of that as well, and he got sent to jail for telling people to oppose World War One. I just think when power is not looked at dialectically, it's very easy to just come up with these like lies and not connect anything.
1000%.
Yes.
Completely agree.
Go on.
Yeah. I think that it has to do with the liberal worldview, because they do this thing where, at least in my history classes, they and construct their own history by going, okay, this happened, then this happened, then this happened, and then connecting it only on a surface level. This happened for the reason that these politicians state it happened. Like, there's just a belief in whatever historical figure said, which is, I think, an interesting way to go about history, because I think you need to have a lot more context. But, like, for example, when we've been studying things like the constitutionalism in Europe, they take everything at face value. At least my class does. Maybe people have better classes than I do, but they've taken everything at face value that those thought leaders said, and then so they make it more about religion than about the class struggle that was going on to oppose the monarchy. Which, for me, and that's a distant one to kind of show that they do this consistently throughout history, is that when they take this individualist worldview, apparently, first off, not only do you have to believe everyone, but, like, it allows them to internalize things like Nazi propaganda, and how that infects a lot of liberal media now, and how we talk about Nazi Germany. Like, a lot of people point out that Nazi Germany had a really good economy, which was recovering before Hitler got into power, but that narrative has seeped in because they just believe so easily, because they don't have a methodology to approach anything historical, or they do have one, but it's bad. That's what I should say.
Yeah, I think that's perfectly said, and that ties into what Jack was saying about using material analysis and using dialectics when you're looking at history, and how necessary that is to, like, get past that surface level of just, like, listening to what the big man in charge said,
Yeah, and just to do a small tangent, this is why it's very important, especially with what's being said nowadays on the media, to always present our side of things. And of course, our side of things, has to be, in tip-top shape. But still, we have to constantly, be on the ready to counter any, liberal, conservative, any capitalist narrative. Because the second we allow it to run amok, that can be very dangerous where that can go. But I digress.
Yeah, I just think with all of this, to just reiterate a little bit, is just how important having a consistent worldview is, and viewing as things have changed over the course of history by the people, not due to some vague movement of history or great men or women or whatever. It's the people, and I think that's the number one thing to get across, and how easy it is to suppress things, is thinking that people need to have some great leader, when in actuality it's people that are the drivers of history. And I think that's just very important, and why leftist suppression works so well, is because people get to feel so isolated in a lot of these situations where they think there is no other option, I'm stuck, and so I must continue in this path, because if I look at quote-unquote history, all it will make me out to think is that nothing can change by myself, or nothing can change. I can't do anything, and I think that's the factor of leftist suppression, is just this constant, isolation, and trying to make people feel isolated, and to keep like this driver of history down, so people don't take this approach.
Right, because what is a people's movement if they can't come together and build coalition and commiserate with one another in the face of like all of this stuff,
Okay, sorry, my mic turned off. Yeah, I think that creating that consistent worldview also like prevents us from doing those awful one-to-one comparisons that we do with bourgeois versus communist revolutions versus even monarchy or feudalistic revolutions or whatever. And because that's one of those things is that I've realized with talking with a lot of liberals, because I really enjoyed history, and for a long time I held those very, very liberal views on how things work, but it always ends up being inconsistent. Like how I even became a communist was literally trying to find the most consistent logic to view the world from, and I think that first off is a strength of Marxism, and dialectical materialism, and I think that creating these sociological viewpoints for ourselves, and that way we can be a lot more consistent. Like I can usually now be presented with history, go okay, and then be able to process it and fit it into the narrative easily. Fit it into the narrative of my viewpoint easily, and go, oh, okay, so this is how this works, and this is how that works, and I think that that's kind of a real strength versus the liberal ideology where it's kind of flip-floppy. And I know that when I was right-wing conservative, not only am I embarrassed of that time, but also I couldn't argue with communists at like all. I just couldn't argue with them because they would bring things up, and I would and contradict. Like I would say this thing about this, and then they would point out, and I would point out something about a specific socialist country example, and then they point out how there's actually an example of a capitalist country doing something quote unquote just as bad, or so on and so forth, and that's hard to argue against. And I think that adds to the suppression factor.
Yeah, I think that's what makes it so easy, as well as like this constant, to segue it a little bit, I think, to just show this like constant militarization you see right before suppression, like the Iraq War, the military in Chile or West Germany, where the police became ever more powerful, or in the UK during the Troubles, they started doing police checkpoints in Northern Ireland and in England as a whole, or Great Britain, I should say. Or, under Franco, they had the military patrolling more and more, the dictatorship in Brazil, all of these things. Like, leftist suppression doesn't come out of nowhere. It's not like, oh, snap the fingers, we're living under fascism. It's this slow crawl to it that you start to see this increased militarization. You start to see this increase in nationalism. You start to see these increases in, fascist views. These don't just appear. They happen, like, over time. So I think that's the number one thing that needs to be noted for people to know about leftist suppression, is how it comes about. It's not a slow crawl to just leftists being killed in a field in mass. It's very gradual. Like the Nazis, they didn't take power after one moment of founding. They existed for a decade prior. Slowly, took more and more power. The KPD, took the line of social fascism and it failed on their face. And what happened afterwards was a brutal annihilation of the communist movement in Germany. Like, so many things can go on and on and on. And I think that's the number one thing that we should get across is just this slow crawl to leftist suppression is a slow crawl. It is not just snap. We're all living in prison now. It's a gradual thing.
Right, and they do like to use the military as a way, like, that's always the counter, isn't it? When we talk about revolution, well, the U.S. population can't fight the military. Like they roll out their tanks and we do our parades and like they did that in Cuba before the Cuban Revolution, where they paraded their military, and then the Cuban people were actually still able to do that. And most revolutions had the same exact problem, where the opposition to the revolution would bring out their tanks, and this militarization, I think, is used as kind of, first off, it's good to be, or for them as a class to have their armed forces ready for the suppression of leftist ideas, and then it gets to be used as propaganda to help suppress it. Because if I criticize the military, or you criticize the military, or anyone criticizes it for any reason, we're unpatriotic, the military's too big, whatever it is, and I do think that helps actually materially suppress people, because no one wants to. No one, if they fed off of U.S. propaganda, thinks that they can actually beat the United States.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree.
I think that's the revolutionary nihilism that needs to get gotten over. Is like a drone can't watch a street corner, like a tank can't police people at a grocery store, like all of these things. Like, it's numbers that matter. Like, you can have the strongest military on the planet, but it can still be overthrown. Like, at a time, the Japanese were what, the third strongest military on the face of the earth, the fourth, top 10 at minimum, and who beat them? Mao and a bunch of ragtag guerrillas working with the Kuomintang a little bit, but they still beat the Kuomintang, who was like warlords and actually well-trained soldiers. They beat both of them with guerrillas. Like, who beat Cuba? Guerrillas against a well-trained U.S.-backed army. Who like all these things.
Ho Chi Minh, Vietnam.
And we can even go to the Russian Revolution, where every capitalist nation on earth was trying to restore the monarchy, or what was called the whites back then, whether it be the United States Army, Britain, France. I can list the entire list right now. Mm-hmm. But, like, obviously to fight against suppression, particularly, anti-communist suppression, like, it isn't just enough to just, like, issue a statement, issue tons of photos, and issue a lot of videos and articles. We need to do, the militancy. We need to have some militancy. The ones that Chairman Jack was just listing right now. And, if we can't, like, put out action, then what we have to say will really be worth nothing in a lot of people's eyes, because they'll think we haven't done anything for our word and whatnot. So, we have to live by our words, basically. But that's all I'm going to say.
Yeah, I think it's really, given the times that we're in now, it's kind of a moment that we have to recognize and capitalize on. We have to see that we have an opportunity with the pressures that we're facing from, COVID-19 and from everything. we have to step up and we have to rally against like all of like the narratives that are being passed about, you know, Cuba being ineffectual, or about China like spreading this virus and all of this stuff like that. This is just a perfect example in front of us right now of the ways in which like narrative is being controlled, and in which the socialist movements are being, you know, oppressed because of obviously capitalism not wanting its ass to be shown to the entire world.
Yeah, I think you know, really what I just want to get across quickly is to always, you know, be questioning imperialist media, as that's what is the number one tool of leftist oppression. That's what comes first, is the, excuse me, is sticking in people's minds of saying, well, revolution is impossible, the government is the only way to do things, reformist tactics, whatever. Can realize these, like, the imperialist media is not your friend. It will never tell you something in your class interest. So that's number
Never.
one. Number two is just to take a worldview that connects everything, as that is the number one defeater of this imperialist mindset. Is we have to, you know, constantly be thinking of things as connected, and that the masses are what's most important, as those are the real movers of history. And finally is just never turn denialism in the face of the suppression. We must come together now more than ever after the coronavirus and things like that. This unmasking Antifa laws and everything is, we can do whatever is possible, but the masses have to come together and realize it is possible. And that's what the simple phrase educate, agitate, and organize is so important. And that's really all I have to say.
Yeah. One thing I will say though is that what was said earlier about how, you know, it doesn't happen in an instant. There's a gradual build up. Is that from the eye of someone who doesn't really pay attention, it would seem that way, which I think is why we all need to keep an eye open on this thing. You know, pay attention to what's going on around you, because one day it may seem like, you know, everything's fine, but the next, really, it's all because of the buildup that happened, and that's why we all need to make sure to pay attention to what's happening to the world around us.
Yeah, I agree with all these words. To just quickly say a few lines. The masses are the real heroes, as you know, Chairman Jack has been paraphrasing the entire time from, you know, Comrade Mao, and obviously kill the capitalist in your mind. But Ormica, last words.
Yeah, no, and I think that being critical of general suppression is kind of um, is somewhat common, but people often think that, or when confronted with leftist suppression, it is surprising, and it does crack the foundations of a lot of liberal thought. So I think that it is important to talk about how we've been suppressed, and then also what the material reality is of that, because that's the thing, isn't it? Like, our First Amendment says we should have freedom of press, and of course we know when that was written there were lots of exceptions, but our First Amendment says it. Like, there's this whole narrative of, oh well, because I can criticize the government, sometimes I have freedom of speech, or whatever it is. When minority groups and leftists have been consistently suppressed in the media, um, in the media and in legislation, and it's extremely consistent. We have the origins all the way back, way back, and it is consistently like a specter on socialist organizing.
Yeah, I think the things that you listed off, Jack, were just really succinct and really like something that you can follow. In a time like now, like having a proper lens to be able to make the connections between the events happening around you and the actual people that are influencing those, and the actual people that this suppression of different narratives, those who it serves to uphold and those who it serves to support. I think you need to be able to look at things with a critical lens and adopt that when you feel most alienated and most isolated from those around you.
Yeah, so I think that has been everyone's closing statement. So to close, simply, I have been Chairman Jack.
Volgin.
Thank you very much. This is Taras.
This is Ormica.
And this is Wiktora. And goodbye.
Goodbye. Boom, we did it. That was